In this second installment in this series, I will continue to expand upon the definition of interference as a broad economics term by introducing a more complex modern transaction as a demonstration of the application of the term by example. I will then use the example to begin to explore how interference can incite our most violent tendencies, if not otherwise mitigated. First, the example. In this hypothetical example, we have two parties that would like to engage in a trade transaction. One, John, owns an up-and-coming steel mill in western Pennsylvania, and the other, Juan, is looking to start a major car manufacturing company in Guatemala. In this hypothetical, Juan wants to buy steel from John in immense quantities in exchange for US dollars. We will also have to assume that John and Juan are both aware of each other's basic intentions and, as such, have agreed to meet in the Bahamas, rent a meeting space, and to there conduct the contract negotiations pertinent to the transaction. As this is a strict hypothetical, we will simply have to assume that this very basic communication took place and not concern ourselves with how that manifested. You can see from this map how the negotiation will mechanically transpire. John is located in Munster, Pennsylvania, and Juan in Guatemala, and they have agreed to meet in the Bahamas. John and Juan get on their planes and head to the Bahamas. The two then sit down at the negotiation table and begin their negotiations. Juan leads off in Spanish, but John only speaks English, and to John this might as well be gibberish. Confused, John retorts in English, but Juan only speaks Spanish, so, to him, this might as well be gibberish. Confused, the two parties get back on their planes, head back to their offices, get translators, and fly all the way back to the Bahamas. Now able to overcome the language barrier, the two come to terms, confirm mutual consent to the transaction, fly home, and conduct business as usual. I have used these maps to help clarify and to illustrate an important point that might get missed. Had both parties spoken English or Spanish, there would be no return flight to get the translator, no hiring of a translator, no rescheduling of the meeting, no second flight to the Bahamas, and no rental of meeting space therein. As you can imagine, this transaction has become very expensive. However, there is a crucial element of cost that is not necessarily obvious in this transaction, and that is the opportunity cost associated with missing out on the initial agreement. Scheduling a new meeting, hiring the translator, and scheduling international flights, because John and Juan have very busy schedules, has delayed the contract negotiations by 2 months. In that time, the property Juan bought to set up his factory is accruing interest, and nothing is being produced at his factory to help offset the debts associated therewith. Why would this matter to the local Guatemalans? Juan was hoping to open up the first major auto manufacturer in Guatemala, and because he is manufacturing locally, he can produce a car equal in quality to imports, but lower in price because he can avoid heavy import costs, as importing raw steel is easier and cheaper than importing a finished car. This means that more Guatemalans would be able to afford cars than previously, and they could then use those cars to be more productive in their daily lives, which, in turn, further improves their wealth and living conditions. More obviously, the dock hands and factory workers that were hoping to have good-paying jobs will have to wait 2 months before they can be put to work and collect a paycheck with which they might feed their families. On the other hand, John, who was hoping to expand his facility, thereby allowing him to make more steel per square foot, has to wait another 2 months for the cash from Juan to be sent to offset the investment interest he is incurring. Further, if John is in the exploratory phases, not having this contract secured means waiting 2 more months before he can guarantee a source of revenue to get approved for the loan, which may preclude him from getting a loan at all. The expansion means more steel per square foot of his factory can be produced, offering John a competitive advantage by allowing him to defer certain costs through scale. The result is that every ounce of steel he produced is now cheaper, and he can, therefore, pass on some of that cost savings to his buyers to realize that competitive advantage, exposing his company to revenue sources he otherwise would not get. In short, the U.S. economy will, in general, get cheaper steel. It will also get the high-paying jobs created by the expansion for which his community in western Pennsylvania is desperate. As you can see, a lot is riding on this transaction. Of course, the greatest opportunity cost is that further transactions like this one will have to wait until this transaction is completed. As discussed in the previous video, there are 2 elements to a mutually consensual transaction: the mutual consent and the transaction itself. In the case of John and Juan, there are terms under which they can offer mutual consent. With a successful transaction, John and Juan are able to offer their consent to a set of terms, and the exchange of goods, indicated here by the yellow arrows, and which represent the transaction itself, follows. However, in the initial meeting, John offers his consent to one set of terms and Juan the other. They may be the same set of terms once translated, but until they are translated, the terms, at least at the most surface and literal of levels, are not the same. In this case, we have introduced a language barrier which has created an obstacle that has obstructed the maximization of mutually consensual transactions. Without this obstacle, not only would this transaction take place, it would mean, in the same time frame, more total mutually consensual transactions taking place. Notice that the two yellow arrows that represent the transaction itself can only follow the arrows of consent, meaning that not only has consent been removed, the language barrier has acted as an obstacle to the transaction itself. In this case, John and Juan are reasonable people. The transaction could still take place without mutual consent in theory if the language barrier is overcome by the element of deceit, and we will get into that shortly. I have tried to draw the language barrier as a literal obstacle for the sake of clarifying the fact that the language barrier represents a form of interference. Note that, although not all communication failures are a source of interference, language barriers represent only one form. Another is deceit, as deceit removes the element of consent from one party of the transaction. In this case, John has consented to terms. Juan can then introduce the element of deceit, here indicated by the blue line, and proverbially push these terms to the side. Juan can introduce the element of deceit by lying about exchanging US dollars and instead wind up sending counterfeit dollars, or in a simpler example, the equivalent in raw sugarcane, Guatemala's chief export. In this case, the two parties head back to their home countries and a transaction takes place, but only at the terms to which Juan has consented. Notice that what is missing is the arrow from John, representing his consent to the transaction. This blue line of deceit has acted as an obstacle to mutual consent in this transaction and is, therefore, a form of interference. One type of communication failure that does not constitute interference is incompetence. This is because parties to a transaction cannot interfere with their own ability to consent, as their ability to consent is not interfering with, well, their ability to consent, as they are one and the same. In the case of the obviously mentally handicapped, if the other party has deliberately deceived the handicapped party, that is an example of deceit, and the handicap is not the source of interference. Instead, it is the deceit which represents the source of interference. There may be other considerations to make to determine the moral validity of the transaction. However, this discussion is about the role of interference, and negotiative incompetence is not itself a form thereof. This train of logic is actually what has formed the basis for the opinion of the court in Smith v. Hughes, 1871. I recommend this case as further reading on the matter. It is easy to see how government can act as a source of interference. Simply put, a Guatemalan tax on imports of U.S. products could preclude Juan from affording steel at a price at which John can afford to sell the steel. In this case, the tax has interfered with the transaction and, to a lesser extent, consent to the transaction, as the two parties will never be able to consent to terms. Even simpler, the U.S. could establish an embargo on trade with Guatemala, banning exports to that country altogether. Backing up, let us remind ourselves that there is a lot riding on this transaction. As such, both parties have a great interest in getting the thing they seek in this transaction, Juan the steel and John the US dollars. In our previous video's example, we considered Farmer Brown and Farrier Smith. In that example, Brown wanted Smith's ferrying services, and Smith wanted Brown's oats. One way Smith could obtain Brown's oats, as discussed in the previous example, was to steal the oats. Even without government, Smith can easily recognize that the better transaction is to trade his services for the oats, because he knows the transaction of stealing Brown's oats does not end with his theft. Of course, if Smith is genuinely starving and needs the oats now to live through today, he might risk Brown carrying his musket over to Smith's house and steal the oats, because Smith knows he won't make it through the day without the oats anyway. This is part of a risk evaluation I will discuss in another video, but suffice it to say, Smith has introduced an element of interference that may provoke Brown's most violent tendencies. In today's example, John wants Juan's cash and Juan wants John's steel. Either party could overcome the interference introduced by the language barrier by either hiring a translator or, instead, introduce their own interference by stealing the other's good instead of flying back to the Bahamas. Although hiring the translator and flying back to the Bahamas is expensive, It should be clear that that cost pales in comparison to the cost of stealing the steel, even in the absence of government. When factoring in the opportunity cost, however, that balance may no longer be the case. That said, another option would be to simply buy the steel from, for example, Miguel in Mexico, who speaks fluent Spanish and can meet at the Guatemalan border and on significantly less notice, and with, presumably, lower delivery costs. Let's assume Miguel generally sells the steel at an otherwise net higher price than John, which is why Juan wanted to buy from John in the first place. In this case, even though his community is desperate for the steel and the cheap cars, which they will no longer be getting at the originally hoped price and time, the level of interference the language barrier introduced is not very great and is an easy hurdle to overcome. To expand, I'll use the bars from the previous video. This bar represents the interference introduced by the language barrier. It is not a great obstacle and is overcome by simply hiring a translator. In this case, I've created a very literal visual representation of this effect for clarity. Note that the slope of the arc, which we will call the leap, is not very steep, and the leap is not very tall. But what if there was a total embargo on US-Guatemalan trade instituted by either country? This is a significantly greater degree of interference, and hiring a translator alone is not enough to overcome the new interference. One could then choose to instead deal with Miguel from Mexico, but he would prefer to just hire the translator and deal with John because that would be cheaper. In this way, we can see one of the fundamental elements of interference. The level of interference introduced can be measured by the cost to overcome it. Note that if there were a total embargo and one had no choice but to deal with, for example, Johann from Germany, the two bars would stack and the cost to overcome those two hurdles would be additive and thus greater than the bar here shown. Other methods of overcoming certain types of interference have greater costs, which, in this case, reflect steeper leaps, which can allow a party to overcome progressively greater interference. It should be clear now that the greater the level of interference, the greater the cost to engage in mutually consensual transactions, and this additional cost is always a deterrent to prosperity in a community. We can now make the final leap, which I have left for last to show that in a rational, reasonable, and civilized society, this final leap should be a last resort. If the level of interference is so great that it exceeds the top of this slide by enough to preclude Juan from obtaining his steel by any mutually consensual transaction, he will be forced to either suffer the consequences of not ever obtaining the steel, which are dire, or engage in a transaction that is no longer mutually consensual. Juan may either remove the transaction itself or remove the mutual consent. Without the mutual consent, there will almost universally be incited some form of violence. Either the removal of consent itself, as when Brown orders Smith to shoot his horses at gunpoint, or in the inevitable retaliation, when Brown brings his musket to Smith's house after finding his oats stolen. More resourceful parties will be able to find more ways to overcome interference, but interference ad infinitum will inevitably incite our most violent tendencies. This is true of business transactions, but it is also true of personal transactions. I will expand upon that in another video, and I hope to eventually get to explain the concept of interference as the justification for the importance of the broad protection of a guarantee of free speech. My next video, however, will be a short video explaining the role of interference in a labor agreement as per popular request. So if you've liked this presentation, stay tuned, subscribe, and I will have a new video out for you shortly. As always, I welcome your input in the comments section and encourage viewers who enjoyed to click the like button. Until the next time, this is Mike from the Captain Phoenix channel signing off.